Everyone in the mainstream media is currently losing their minds because Premier Doug Ford cut funding to Forests Ontario. But there's another side to the story. Turfing this program is long overdue. It's been unsuccessful in meeting its goals, and it has taken money from the Tides Foundation.
I want to mourn the loss of all the old growth trees I've seen.
Now, we've all seen that clip probably a dozen times. It's funny, but it could also be the visual representation of the crying and the wailing and the moaning and the flailing from the mainstream media and the organized left, but I repeat myself there, about Premier Doug Ford's PC government in Ontario cutting funding to something called Forests Ontario. Now, you'd think Doug Ford was out there actually cutting down the forests, which is something I would probably pay money to see, but instead, the Ford government has cut the $4.7 million tax dollars that go to the $50 million tree planting project run by Forests Ontario. The project has a goal of planting 50 million trees, mostly on private land, in Ontario by 2025. It all sounds very egalitarian and green, but when you drill down, it's just a plot to subsidize a landowner's landscaping costs, and at the same time, it's a corporate welfare scheme, and the companies involved are not even a little bit ashamed to admit it. Forests Ontario basically takes cash from the government and then buys trees. Then they get volunteers to plant the trees on private land. It's just a money-making project for seedling companies, which they openly admit without even the slightest bit of shame at all. Here is from the CBC News article that whinged about the funding cut. It may be a way for the government to save some money, but it's very short-sighted and it's going to cost us a lot more in the future, said Ed Patchell. Patchell said the loss of the program means about 30 to 40% of Ferguson Tree Nursery's base income will disappear, and he will have to cut 6 to 8 full-time and seasonal staff. According to Forests Ontario's yearly report, Ferguson Tree Nursery is indeed one of the seedling companies that they work with. As it turns out, though, Ferguson Tree Nursery sells trees to the public. You can just walk in and buy them. So I don't know why they need this intermediary called Forests Ontario to take public money to give trees back to the public who could just buy them themselves in the first place if they wanted to for a couple of bucks a piece. Now, I like trees probably far more than your biggest, greenest environmentalist, but I don't like them as much as I cannot stand crony capitalism at the expense of beleaguered Ontario taxpayers. Besides, Forests Ontario isn't actually all that successful at what they do if the goal is actually planting trees and not propping up these seedling companies with corporate welfare. Forests Ontario says the goal is to plant 50 million trees in Ontario by 2025. Are they even close to achieving this goal? Not at all. Let's look at Forests Ontario's 2017 annual report. Their own numbers. They say since 2007, they've planted 28 million trees. Okay, but that's last year's data. In this CTV article, Rob Keane, CEO of Forests Ontario, said since 2008, more than 27 million trees have been planted across Ontario through his program. So they're barely halfway to meeting their goal. They've probably gotten some $50 million from the Ontario government over the past 11 or 12 years based on these current funding levels. And they only have 5.5 years left to meet their targets. That alone is reason enough to kill the government funding to this program. They are failing and wasting taxpayer dollars, while seedling companies are getting rich off the backs of taxpayers. We heard the same moaning and crying when Premier-elect Jason Kenney promised to end the quote-unquote free light bulb installation program here in Alberta. Won't anyone think of the government-subsidized light bulb installers? Now, back in reality, the pros, the people who actually have to be accountable for the money they spend out there in the forest, well, they plant more than 50 million trees in Ontario each and every single year, something this charity won't get done in 18 years, from the same CTV article. The government is committed to balancing the budget in a responsible manner. Justine Lukowitz said in a statement that the forestry industry, which depends on a sustainable supply of wood, is a responsible steward of the province's forests. On average, the forestry industry plants 68 million trees per year, creating jobs for foresters, nurseries, and tree planters, she wrote. Okay, so that's neat. So you don't need the government to create tree planting jobs, and you can plant 68 million trees a year. Well, that's cool. Now let's talk about the finances of Forests Ontario. They are a registered charity here in Canada, so we get to see what they spend on salaries. Look at this. Compensated full-time positions. Forests Ontario has one person earning between $160,000 and nearly $200,000 per year, and 9 more earning between $40,000 and nearly $80,000 per year. And Forests Ontario spends nearly a full quarter of the money they get from the Ontario government on salaries and consulting fees. The total compensation for all positions is $950,000, with 12 full-time employees, 8 part-time employees, and professional and consulting fees totaling nearly $62,000. But now let's get into how Forests Ontario has taken money from the Anti-Oil, Anti-Canada Tides Foundation. Forests Ontario turns up in the data compiled by researcher Vivian Krause, detailing how the American environmental charity clearinghouse, the Tides Foundation, was distributing money in Canada between 2008 and 2015. Here is the line item for the grant money to Forests Ontario. Forests Ontario, 2015, Ontario Envirothon, $6,000. And look, I know it's not a ton of money, it's only $6,000. But given that the Ford government has passed a motion in the legislature saying that they will not stand in the way of Canada's oil and gas development, I think it is a good thing for Ontario to cut funding, public dollars, to organizations that take money from foreign environmental charities that block Canadian oil and gas. First, it sends a strong message to these so-called environmental charities that they shouldn't allow themselves to become colonized and co-opted by the Tides Foundation, to be bought off as on-the-ground Canadian mercenaries of this American branch if they want to access funding from the government. It makes taking money from the Tides Foundation radioactive, the way it should be. But doing this also sends a message to us here in Alberta, one we haven't heard in a very long time from our friends in Ontario, and that's that they're on our side. For the Rebel.media, I'm Sheila Gunn Reid. Did you know that there is yet another way to get your Rebel Media fix? All of our premium content shows are available as downloadable podcasts. You can get those at therebel.media/listen. Or you can find us on any of your favorite podcast directories. And while you're there, be sure to leave us a 5-star review. It's a great way to help us out here at The Rebel without ever having to spend a dime.